My name is Chris Henley. I work for a company called Veeam Software. I spent the last 5 years working there doing product strategy solutions, doing a lot of public talks like this one, talking about technology. From a background and expertise perspective, I've spent the past, I can't believe I'm going to say it, just over 20 years working in the software industry, have gotten the opportunity to work for organizations very small, mid-sized, large enterprise-sized businesses. Did an 8-year stint with Microsoft, have been fortunate to work with every version of Windows Server that has been released, even back when it was called Windows NT. Several years ago, I started working with a friend and who's now a co-author named Matt Hester, and he and I started writing books together. We had been fortunate to work with some other, I guess, kind of luminaries, if you will, in the publishing industry. And they said, hey, why don't you start writing? And I started thinking about ideas around technology much more than I thought about products in technology. And I started working with some developers, some writers. It became really easy to find solutions that worked when you start thinking about concepts rather than products. And what I'd want to do with you today is talk to you about some of the concepts related to hybrid cloud availability strategies in 2016. Now, in order to do that, I want to introduce you to some concepts from the past that are really important, some concepts from the present that are really important, and we'll introduce some concepts that are coming rapidly and will become the future of what we talk about when we talk about availability. Now, I will not lie to you, I work for Veeam. I love Microsoft, so we are going to focus on those two things. The things that I talked to you about today, the concepts, actually work in any environment. Whether you choose to use Veeam or some other software to do your availability solutions, the concepts stay the same. Whether you choose Microsoft Azure or some other third-party cloud provider, the concepts stay the same. My goal here for you and for me, when you walk out of here today, I hope you understand the concepts related to high availability in a hybrid cloud environment. If we get there, I think we've done really well. Also, very important, I share out all of my slides, so if you want to use the slide presentation that you see today, you're more than welcome to do so. You can simply download them and use them at your discretion. I will pull out the slide notes that I use. I don't put those in to share. You're going to remember all of this conversation anyway, and generally speaking, I'll put things that are cues for me into those notes that will be meaningless for you. The last thing I want is for you sending me an email that says, what does Will Montgomery mean on slide number 3? It means something to me, but for you, maybe not so much. Let's talk about the first concept. If we're going to talk about availability, there is one concept, and it's not a new one. It's called the 3-2-1 rule. And it simply says we always make 3 different copies of any single piece of data. We always use 2 different media types to store those 3 different copies, and we always take one of those media types and put it in an off-site location. Now, that rule has been around for decades. It has transitioned across all 3 architectural modalities that we've used to build networks. Now, when I say architectural modalities, I mean the mainframe days, the client-server days, and now the cloud days. When we think about data protection and we think about availability, this becomes one of our core tenets. So it's called the 3-2-1 rule. It's not something I made up, it's something that the industry's used forever. The other thing that we always talk about in terms of availability are these 2 things. They're called the objectives, and they're the why we do availability in the first place. The first one is called the recovery point objective, and the second one is called the recovery time objective. How many of you have heard this before? I thought you might have, which is why we only spend 1 minute on those 2 objectives. For those of you that have not heard this before, please go back, do a little bit of review. Wikipedia is a good place to start. You can actually get lengthy discussions on all 3 topics, RPOs, RTOs, and the 3-2-1 rule. Some key things. If I were to ask you, let's go ahead and ask you, what is the ideal RPO and RTO? Yeah, he knows. 0 is the ideal RPO and RTO. Now, what's your real RPO and RTO? Oh, who said it? Hours. Unfortunately, that's oftentimes exactly right. Now, the questions that we'd probably ask ourselves at this point is, okay, so what influences our RPO and RTOs in terms of their time? And we actually measure both of them in terms of time, which is really weird because one of them says recovery point, and it's about the amount of data that we lose or we can accept in terms of loss, but we measure it in terms of time. The recovery time objective obviously is measured in terms of the amount of time that we can be without operation. Our ideal time would be 0. And 0 is actually becoming more and more attainable. But in order to get to 0, we're going to have to move from measuring in hours to minutes to seconds to milliseconds. And then we start getting into the areas where we're really happy with this concept of what we call availability. And it's interesting, you'll notice that I don't use the word backup. I'll use it once there, but I'll try not to use it again in the presentation because backup is what we used to do in the old client-server model when operating systems and software were tied to the operating underlying hardware. Today, when we move to the cloud infrastructure model, we no longer talk about backup because we're no longer tied to hardware. One of the key principles of the cloud architecture design is that we have hardware abstraction. We start to look at things like storage in a pooling fashion, and processors in a pool, and memory in a pool. And we use those pools to allocate to resources, and they're very flexible. So they can't have direct ties. Remember I told you about Will Montgomery? It's one of the notes on this slide. There's a school in England, it's called the Bedford School. It was established in 1552. It's been around for a few years. Will's been around for a few years as well. Will is actually the chair over learning and teaching at the Bedford School. He's been established as that chair now for several years. He is not a young man by any stretch of the imagination. And his company, the Bedford School, and I say company because like any other educational organization, they rely on data for their operations. And so we're going to simply call them a company, a business. Bedford School stores all of Will's data, and this is by Will's choice, on his laptop. He's connected to Google, and he uses Google Drive and copies everything from his laptop to the cloud, which is actually not a bad choice for him. And in order to meet the 3-2-1 rule, actually I don't know that he did this on purpose, he also synchronizes everything from his laptop to his home computer. Do you see his 3 copies of data? Do you see the 2 different media types that he's chosen? And one of them in an off-site location. In fact, in his case, he has 3 different locations, one of them being his laptop, which is entirely portable. Really a good design. Now, 2009, Bedford School adopts Veeam as their choice to do availability solutions and protect their data. 2014, Will opens his laptop and he sees that little shield that says, for 2 bitcoins, $300 US, we will happily release to you the private key that will let you decrypt the data on this machine and all others to which it connects. So Will's life's work, all of his research, all of the presentations, all of the spreadsheets, all of the everything is now encrypted. It's called ransomware. It makes me angry, like it does you. And unfortunately for Will, he has kind of 2 choices. $300 US sounds pretty good to get all of my data back. Although, once you pay the $300 US, you've ensured your status as a victim in that crime, right? I realize that some of you are going to be forced to make that payment because you have to have that data and don't have any other solution. Bedford School had another solution. They had done what all of you are going to do. They took their Veeam Availability Suite tools and they made backups of Will's laptop. Because they had a backup of his laptop, the laptop's not connected to the backup. The backup is encrypted. The backup is compressed, the backup is deduplicated, and it's stored on the Bedford IT department's on-premises server. He calls the IT department. Bob Eady says, yeah, I got a backup of that. Hang on just a second. Let's wipe your laptop. Let's wipe your home machine, which unfortunately we didn't have a backup of because it's his home machine, but all of his important files are still there. And then we'll wipe your Google Drive, and then we'll recover all of your files out of our Veeam backup. And if you want, we can just recover one file at a time. And Will says, how long will it take? And they say, if you'll tell us the files, we'll do it while you're on the phone. Yeah, his recovery can be very, very fast. Well, we measure it in minutes, which is what all of you want, right? Bedford School is a great example of what we all hope for in availability. What we hope happens is that when something like the CryptoLocker virus is embedded into our organization, when someone who's affected by it calls our help desk, we want to be able to reply while the customer is on the phone. That's the standard we're looking for. From an RPO and RTO time, we would say we want RPOs and RTOs in the 15 minutes or less time frame. So when we talk today and we start talking about goals in a hybrid cloud environment for availability, that's what our goal is. We're looking at sub 15-minute RPO and RTO times. How many of you have that today? Are you using Veeam by chance? He nodded his head and he goes, yeah. I'm sorry, I don't have any t-shirts to throw. Hit us at our booth. Hopefully you all already have a t-shirt. Yes, sub 15 minutes is what we're looking for from an RPO and RTO time. How will that happen? I told you I wanted to talk principles and I also want to talk technologies. Let's talk about the technologies that make this happen. Veeam is not new. We've been around for about 10 years. We'll celebrate our 10th anniversary the end of this summer. So 8 years of innovation, first to market with our Veeam Availability Suite products. The things that we've done, and I highlighted a bunch of them here in red. I know you're technology affiliated, and so I'm going to run through these quick. If you have questions, say, hey, tell me more about that one, and we'll stop. My goal in life is not to see how many slides we can cover. It's to see how deep we can go in the concepts that we talk about. I want to hit some highlights for you. The first edition of Veeam, back in V1, back in first quarter of 2008, we introduced something called instant file level recovery. We actually filed a patent. We still have the patent today for something called vPower that simply says, I want to get into a backup file. I want to be in that backup file while it's compressed and deduplicated. I want to be able to get access to the contents of that backup file, and I want to recover the stuff out of it without doing the traditional rehydration, decompression, restore process that we used to have to do. Remember that? Remember when Windows actually used to have a special mode where you could restart the machine? You'd provide a special password simply so you could restore? Yeah. Why don't we do that today? Well, because we don't use client-server infrastructure models like we did back then. Now we use a cloud-based model. And we break the tie between the underlying hardware and the operating system and the software. So we now do instant file level recovery. How fast is instant? Well, unfortunately, we don't measure it in milliseconds, but we can measure it as fast as you can click the button. So usually it takes a second or two. We can actually measure the time that it takes on a very fast appliance-style device. We can measure it around 160 to 200 milliseconds. Faster than you can click the button, which is really pretty cool. Other cool things that we've seen. Not only do we love instant file level recovery, but we love this thing called instant virtual machine recovery. Take the principles that we used with instant file level, apply them to an entire virtual machine, and make it possible for us to recover a machine with its running workloads in under 2 minutes. So if you have a running Exchange server, for example, and it crashes and burns, you happen to have a backup copy, a backup using Veeam, we can point the Veeam server at it and say, bring that backup back online. Don't decompress it. Don't take away its deduplication. Don't run through a traditional restore process. Just start it where it is. Keep it on the backup storage. Run it from there. We'll worry about all of that stuff after the machine is up and running. It takes anywhere from 90 seconds to 2 minutes. and your Exchange server is back online. In most cases, we can actually do the recovery faster than the users can recognize that the service is actually down. Unless you're in the process of sending an email during that tiny window when the Exchange service is actually down, most of us wouldn't recognize if we go 2 minutes without an email. If you do recognize that, I'm sorry for the email traffic that comes to you. Other cool things that we've done. You know that we provide support in both the VMware and the Hyper-V space. I don't highlight that because it's anything extraordinary. The point that I want to get to here with you is that programming and development with a partner is critical. So for us, when we start talking about programming and development in the Veeam environment, we can't successfully program our software. We can't develop that software to work with Hyper-V unless we're working with the Hyper-V development team. We won't program for Azure unless we're working with the Azure development team. People ask me all the time, why is it that Veeam solutions just work with Microsoft? It's because we just develop them with Microsoft. We don't try and develop around them, we only do it with them. So when we talk about key developments, people ask all the time, why doesn't this work yet with Azure? And my answer is because the Azure team hasn't said we want it to work with Azure yet. And I'll tell you that multiple times today. Key things that have happened. Over the course of the past couple of years, Microsoft has released several APIs that have allowed us to do what's called Veeam Explorers 4, and then I'll fill in the blank after that. So Veeam Explorers for Microsoft Exchange. It means that you can make a backup copy of your Exchange server, store it on your on-site data repository or off-site data repository, and then when a executive calls and says, hey, I actually accidentally deleted my email with this attachment in it, can you get it back? We can say, yeah, hang on, and you can recover it to your running Exchange server while he's on the phone, regardless of where it resides. Do you see the difference between backup and availability? I'm trying to use some of the technology to illustrate the concept. When we think about availability, our goal here is to provide low RPO and low RTO times, while at the same time giving the customer the sense and feel of having access to their data anywhere, anytime, any device, any circumstances. That's what we're after. Now, I want to introduce you to something called Veeam Availability Platform for the Hybrid Cloud. Initially, we started down this path of, hey, let's do this session and we'll just talk about connecting to Azure. And that's a great thing, and we could probably spend 90 minutes on it, but I wanted to go a little bit broader. And one of our recent announcements, if you want to go out and watch it on our website, you're welcome to do so. We start to see Veeam in a role of much more than just the backup role. We do backup and recover, and we do it better than anyone else, but we also do a whole bunch of other things. And I want to kind of see them from a holistic perspective rather than just a one-off perspective. Veeam over the past 10 years has remained what we call hardware agnostic. We work with everyone. We'll work with Cisco, we'll work with HPE, we'll work with NetApp, we'll work with EMC, we'll work with Azure, we'll work with anyone. The point here is that we're going to let the customer choose what their hardware operation is going to look like in the background, and we'll simply let that software on the front end utilize what's in the back end hardware. And that's really, really important when we start talking about this idea of availability as it relates to Microsoft Azure, because we don't have to redevelop our software in order to work with Azure. Instead, we simply have to build the connections and tune those connections, which means for you, if you want to go in and start using Microsoft Azure as an availability site, it takes about 30 minutes to set it up. And a part of that is going to be based in licensing. Let's talk about private cloud and virtual workloads. Now today when we talk about private cloud, we often hear the term on-premises. And when on-premises comes into play, we think about on-premises operations in kind of an old idea mentality. We start thinking about our servers, and we think about our clients, and we think about their workloads, and we think about the amount of space that we have, and the amount of processors that we have, and the amount of memory that we can utilize, and the network performance that's available to us. And all of those things are critically important. I don't want you to think that they're not. However, when we think about availability, we want to step up a level. Remember, Hardware abstraction is one of the things that we get from virtualization and cloud. And so when we think about the ideas related to private cloud and availability for our workloads, we automatically move to virtual machines. And that automatically takes us to VMware, and it takes us to Hyper-V. Now, when you protect a workload in either of those two environments, generally speaking, we simply point Veeam's software at those two environments. We say, go get that virtual machine, or go get those virtual machines, or get all of the virtual machines on that particular vSphere client, or get all of the virtual machines on that Hyper-V machine. Get that host, if you will. It's easy to make the transition from the old client-server discussion to the new cloud infrastructure discussion. Veeam does private cloud, and we do it very, very well. That's not going to stop. We'll continue to build solutions for private cloud environments, with the goal being the race to zero. We'd love to see RPO and RTO times in the 0 environment. Now, when we talk about private cloud and virtual networks, one thing I want to touch on here, and then I promise we'll spend the whole rest of the time talking about cloud-based solutions. But this is key. I've heard every executive from every level of Microsoft, and most of them within the past 5 days, describe an environment in the present and the future where data sovereignty is critically important to business. Have you heard Satya say that? This concept of data sovereignty means that you don't just have data ownership, you actually have rights to control the data. And there's a big difference. When we talk about sovereignty in terms of a nation, it's more than just the territory that they own. It's exactly the rights, privileges that they have with that territory. They control everything about it. And when it comes to data, we're seeing exactly the same thing. Data sovereignty at some level is determined by where it is created, where it is stored, and who manages and maintains it. Those kind of 3 key points. So when we talk about working with private cloud solutions, we always begin at the private cloud with our data. We generate it there. It finds its genesis on the private cloud. It's made there, and initially we want it to reside there. From an availability perspective, we want it to reside there because if it's local, it's going to be available faster. We don't get the latency times of moving across a WAN link. And so in almost every circumstance, when we start talking about high availability solutions for hybrid cloud environments, the hybrid cloud first piece is the private cloud piece. And so we use tools running on a private cloud, and we do the data backups, if you will, imagery, snapshots, whatever terminology you want to use, and we do that on premises first, and we store them on premises first. Now, once we've done the initial availability snapshot, and then we've stored that in an on-premises data center, we're going to start to make determinations about where that data will go in the future. Because none of us want to go through this process of consistently going back to our executives and saying, I'm going to need more disks. You know what? I'm out of disk space. I'm going to need more disks. You know, I still need more disks. That's not a process we want to be part of. And so we'll have an initial retention period in our on-premises private cloud environment, and after that initial retention period, then we're going to ship that data somewhere else. Does that make sense? Questions so far? All the concepts here should be simple and straightforward, I'm hoping. Feature highlights that we've already talked about. Instant VM recovery, instant file level recovery, Veeam Explorers. Ooh, let's talk about offsite replication for just a second. I didn't hit that, but I want to make sure that we get this really clear. One of the things that has happened in the past, we're going to say the past 8 years, with availability is the idea that I want to take a virtual machine, or a physical one for that matter, and I want to replicate the virtual machine. Veeam introduced this concept a long time ago, and we've seen it adopted and started to be used now by just about everyone else in the industry. The idea of replication is very simple. Make an initial copy of a virtual machine, put it over here. Every time a change occurs on this one, copy it over to our target, keep it up to date. If something happens to our source machine, not a big deal. We'll say fail over to the target machine, and operation continues to go. In a replication environment, the failover is not automated. It is not a mirror. It is not like the concept of high availability that we see with some with some databases. We're not mirroring them. They don't run in real time side by side with automatic failover. In a replication environment, failover is generated manually. You decide what fails over and when, and we expect RPO and RTO times in that failover environment to be sub 2 minutes. WAN acceleration. If I'm going to do offsite replication, I have to get that data from site A to site B. And in order to get the data from site A to site B, I'm going to need some kind of tool to actually make that replication occur very, very fast. That could be an appliance-based solution. There are several out there. It could be a software-based solution, and there are several out there. The point here is that you cannot simply take data, run it at full size across a WAN link, and expect to get A, great performance, or B, great replication and failover. There must be some form of WAN acceleration. If you choose to use Veeam, there's a built-in software-based WAN accelerator that'll take you up about 10 to 20 times what you would see from a traditional straight copy over a WAN. I'm not going to talk details for you, just want to make sure that you understand that that's available. Deduplication, compression, we've talked about. The virtual lab environment, I'm not going to spend a lot of time touching on this. I'll throw this out there. It would be great if you had a way to actually test your backups and verify their authenticity and their ability to actually function. That box in the traditional backup environment software that says verify backup, that did a checksum valuation of your backup, if the backup was corrupted, it's going to have the same checkup or checksum regardless, right? The corrupted versus the operational, we're not going to know unless we start them. And so the recommendation is you use a virtual lab environment, and you actually test those images of your virtual machines so that you know that they run. Nobody wants to be surprised when it's time to do recovery. We talked about hardware agnostic, and this is where we're going to jump ship from the private cloud environment, and we're going to talk public cloud. VMs in the Microsoft Azure Marketplace are an easy way for us to gain access to a public cloud environment and provide connections back to our private cloud on-premises environment. Now, those VMs are just what we've talked about. They're virtual machines. They're built using traditional Microsoft technologies. In this case, they're a Windows Server VM. Those virtual machines are pre-configured by the author. In our case, we're going to talk about the Veeam virtual machines. If you use somebody else's VMs, obviously they're going to be the author. They're certified by Microsoft before we put them in the Azure Marketplace. If you go out and you look at the Azure Marketplace today, you type in Veeam. Actually, you won't actually have to type in Veeam. One of our applications, Veeam Cloud Connect for service providers, is, I'm supposed to say it this way, one of the most popular virtual machines in the Azure Marketplace. Lawyers tell me that I say if I leave out the one of and just say the most popular, people will actually think it's the most popular application or VM in the Azure Marketplace. And I say, wouldn't that be the appropriate thing? And they say, no, you should really say it's one of the most popular applications in the Azure Marketplace. And so I'll say it that way. It's interesting that Microsoft would put it right in the middle on the top line. Wonder why they would do that. The Azure Marketplace gives us an opportunity to take virtual machines, provision the virtual machine in Microsoft Azure, and then build a connection from our on-premises private cloud to our now Microsoft public cloud. Now you'll notice that there are actually 4 different offerings here. I want to go over them fast with you, and then we'll talk about why you might use something like this and what it will actually do. So the first one there on the left is called VCC for the Enterprise. VCC stands for Veeam Cloud Connect, and its idea is to do just what we've talked about. Connect on-premises private cloud to the Azure public cloud. It takes about 30 minutes to configure. The second one, VCC for service providers, exactly the same virtual machine. No difference. The audience is the only difference. A tool set that allows a managed service provider to build a connection between the managed service provider's on-premises private cloud and the Azure public cloud. The other two, Direct Restore to Microsoft Azure, we'll talk about in a few minutes. Guess what it does? Yeah, it allows you to directly restore to Microsoft Azure. And Managed Backup Portal, which is actually a tool that lets managed service providers provide access to their clients so that they don't have to actually do every line item for them. The backups, you get some degree of self-service. All right, let's talk managed cloud with Veeam Cloud Connect for service providers. We want to begin here because this is where we began with Veeam. When we start talking about this idea of hybrid cloud availability, a customer does not simply want to keep all of their data on premises all of the time. It's very complex to manage and it costs a ton of money. It doesn't meet the 3-2-1 rule. So if I'm a small business, for example, I really would love to be able to have an off-site data center that I could ship all of my data to. If I could get rid of that constantly increasing physical disk cost, that'd be really nice for my organization. And when it comes to availability, there is a seemingly unending stream of new backups, new replication, new storage that I'm going to consume, and so having an off-site provider would be great. Veeam used something called Veeam Cloud Connect for service providers and allows a managed service provider to simply sign up as a Veeam Cloud service provider. That service provider can then connect their backend to Microsoft Azure and ship that data to the Azure environment. So do you see we're kind of picking up 3 locations, and we've distributed the ownership of the data. I shouldn't call it ownership because that's really not what we've distributed. We've distributed the management of the data, who's going to protect it. So on premises, original customer will be responsible for that data. When they ship it to a managed service provider who has a small data center, now the managed service provider is responsible for some time frame until the service provider decides, if they choose to do so, to move that data to Microsoft Azure. Do you see the 3-2-1 rule coming out in the infrastructure design? It's actually quite smart. And the beauty is that the customer gets all of this for a tiny fraction of what they would have spent on disks, administration, IT support, licensing, etc. How long does it take to get to? Well, from a customer's perspective, you hit a drop-down menu in their software and say, I'd like to use that service provider. From a service provider setup perspective, they're setting up the endpoint on their side, and it takes them about 45 minutes to an hour, let's say, and they're set up to do Veeam Cloud Connect. Now, when I first started telling this story, people would come to me and say, Mr. Henley, love the idea of the managed service provider, cloud service provider, but I can't imagine that I want to do business with a guy who set up a managed service connection with 2 racks of servers in his garage and an hour of time spent configuring Veeam Cloud and Service Provider in Microsoft Azure. And I don't blame them. I don't necessarily think I'd want to do that either. Could we go to the other end of the spectrum? The answer is absolutely we could. A managed service provider could be, and in fact is, someone who has a state-of-the-art data center, who has spent millions or billions of dollars in its development. Someone who has said, yeah, I'm going to take customer data in and provide it security at the highest levels, even certified government levels. It's not some guy in his garage. When we talk about managed service providers, I don't want you to think small. I'd like you to think big, because there's a lot more managed service provider business in that large-scale part of our industry than there is in the small-scale part of our industry. Those managed service providers will give us what we'll call managed availability services. They'll use things like the portals that we talked about, Veeam Management Backup Portal, so that they can go in and allow some degree of service to multiple different tenants. And this is critical. We use Microsoft Azure's multi-tenancy capabilities and provide access to those clients in such a way that they have direct and secure access to their data at all times. That has to happen. We encrypt it from end to end. We provide them with opportunities so that the data is encrypted when the backup job runs and stays that way until the data comes to rest. And it stays encrypted at rest. I told you that I don't want you to get the idea that this is something that we do only in the small environment. Let me show you a short video clip here of a company out of Switzerland.
Our 2 data centers, known as SwissFornox 1 and SwissFornox 2, are located very deep inside the Swiss mountains in 2 army bunkers. So we protect the customer's data not just virtually and by encrypting the data, but we also protect it against all known threats physically. Hi, my name is Thomas Liechti and I'm the CEO of Mount 10. Well, our history started in the early 2000s, so we're existing since 10 years now. Mount 10 is the market leader in online backup services in Switzerland, and we figured out that customers would like to provide their data into a safe harbor, and that's why we brought Swiss4Knox as the safest physical place, as well as Mount 10 providing the safest virtual service together. And that's why we put our data centers into the mountains. We came from a pure file backup solution. We've been able to acquire roughly 2,500 customers in the last 10 years. And listening to our customers, they expect from us going forward by providing not just file level and system level backup, but to develop ourselves more towards an availability service provider. So that is enabled actually by the partnership with Veeam. The top benefits we hear from our customers as well as from our partners working with Veeam is the simplicity and the ease of integration into existing environments of our customers. I mean, the beauty of the storage agnostic setup Veeam provides allows customers to use either existing storage infrastructure, but I can also pick and choose the best storage infrastructure for their need. So I think that decoupling of the software versus storage infrastructure is a very great benefit to our customers as well as for us. I think Veeam saved the day for a lot of clients every day. But I think one specific instance I can remember is about 3 or 4 weeks ago when a customer called us pretty nervous because he was infected by a CryptoLocker virus, which encrypted all his data overnight. And we could actually restore, based on the last backup, all their data. So he was a really happy customer. Well, at Mount 10, we've always listened to our customers and partners when it comes to future developments in our company. Our customers told us that Veeam is the choice for them and is absolutely the de facto standard here in Switzerland. They clearly told us, work with Veeam. We started to work with Veeam and it just works.
That's a little different expectation from a managed service provider than you are probably thinking, right? Most of us don't think James Bond style deep in the mountains of Switzerland for our managed service provider. They work with a very specific clientele. You can imagine most small businesses don't call Mount 10 and say, hey, I've got some data I'd like you to secure. Usually they're not interested in the helicopter ride it takes to get there. So they have a very specific clientele that they're serving. But I show you that because I want you to get used to the idea that availability for data really comes across a very wide spectrum. It could be the small mom and pop flower shop operation, or it could be the other end of that spectrum. Guys like this that are storing data literally in Fort Knox. In this case, it's a Fort Knox data center out of Switzerland. So far, we've talked about the managed service provider piece from a hybrid cloud. We really need to talk about the public cloud side, and I want to spend the rest of the time talking about that. Before we do you have any questions around managed service providers and why we talk about them as a key part of a hybrid availability strategy? Either you all are real quiet, real hungry, or that was a great explanation. And I was here for the explanations. You must really be hungry. Let's talk about the connections to Microsoft Azure. So I told you earlier, we're going to focus in on Veeam and Azure, but these solutions, the concepts are valuable for any software connected to Microsoft Azure, to Amazon's web services, to vCloud Air, to other cloud providers that are out there. Remember, Veeam is hardware agnostic, and that extends when we start talking about the cloud. Now, we've done things with Microsoft Azure to facilitate that process that we haven't done with any other provider, the marketplace being a prime example. Will we do something like that with other providers? Probably so. Today we have not. We've only done that with Azure, so we'll focus in on Azure and the Azure Marketplace. When we think about connecting our private cloud environment to the Azure public cloud, there are some principles here that are really critically important. When we think about the on-premises workloads and the Azure environment, we kind of need to define what it is that we want to do with Microsoft Azure. We said earlier that our fastest recovery is actually going to come from an on-premises store. So if we'll store data in our on-premises data center, we probably are going to get the fastest RPO or lowest RPO and RTO times by doing so. Ideally, we'd love to see the things that we do with Microsoft Azure continue to support the low RPO and RTO times. And the way that that's going to occur is by choosing what workloads are going to be stored in Azure. We're going to have to determine what actions we want to take in Microsoft Azure. And then we're going to talk about recovery, how we're going to actually recover from or to Microsoft Azure. One of the things that we found is that, generally speaking, we're best served when we actually do archives to Microsoft Azure. We don't want Azure to be our primary storage. We don't want Azure to be our primary target when it comes to our initial backups. We want there to be a primary target on premises first. We want an initial retention period on premises first. Once that initial has gone past, now we start thinking about Azure as our archival target. That meets what we have as a requirement for a couple of reasons. We know from experience that the vast majority of failure and recovery operations that occur with virtual machines occur within about the first 3 weeks of the initial backup being made. So we actually make recommendations about on-premises retention time frames. We let you choose, of course, pick whatever time frame you want, but we've noticed that somewhere around 21 days happens to be about ideal. Some go as long as 40, some actually go as short as 7. You pick. You choose what works the best for you. After the initial retention time period, now we want to take that data and listen closely. We want to copy it to Microsoft Azure. We don't want to move it there. And the reason that we don't move it there is because we still want you to have the option to do that on-premises recovery. Now, you're going to pick some additional time frame for on-premises retention. Somebody came to us about a little more than 2 years ago and said, hey, I love this idea of on-premises retention and then a movement to Azure, but I'd like to use a device that Microsoft gave me when I bought a bunch of Azure credits. It's called a Store Simple box. Could I use that in conjunction with something like Veeam to get high availability? And we started exploring it. Not only can you use it, but it's actually a great idea. Now, Store Simple is the one that I'm going to talk about here, but there are lots of connectivity style appliances that you can use to connect back to Azure or other public cloud environments. For example, NetApp's AltaVault is a great solution, and it does just what we're talking about here. The idea is very simple. We use the Store Simple box, which is a physical machine that has very fast hardware, some processor, very fast disk, high-speed network connection capabilities, a lot of RAM, and also some built-in intelligence so that it remembers metadata. So we'll use that machine, the Store Simple box. Remember, it could be something else, something from Riverbed, NetApp, you pick. That box will now take the data that we send to it in the form of a copy, and it will start to age it based on a set of rules that we provide. And we'll tell it, hey, after so many days, I want you to start streaming that data up to Microsoft Azure to a data store that we've configured there in blob storage. The Store Simple device will do just that. It will stream the data up to Microsoft Azure, drop it into your blob store. When you decide, I want to recover that data, now you have a couple of places you can look. It might be on premises. You're going to check there first because that'll be your fastest recovery. If it's not there, you might look at your Store Simple box on premises. Now here's what's interesting. The Store Simple box does not differentiate for you what's on premises and what's in Microsoft Azure. And if you're doing instant file level recovery, the Store Simple box will simply look at the metadata, find where it's located, and recover it for you. Now the really cool thing about Store Simple is because of the hardware that's built into it, sometimes we actually get faster recovery from Store Simple than we do from our on-premises disk. We measure them in milliseconds for single file level recovery. Now, when we start moving to larger chunks of data, obviously the time is going to slow down, especially if that data happens to be located way over there on a public cloud Azure server somewhere else. Now I start to think about issues of latency. The beauty of this is we know that after 21 days, generally speaking, the kind of recovery that we're looking for is what's called item level. We're not generally trying to recover whole virtual machines that have crashed and burned after 21 days. We're usually trying to recover individual files. I'm looking for that user account in Active Directory that was deleted 4 months ago. I'd like to restore it and have it run in Active Directory now. I'm looking for that email that was deleted 3 months ago. I'm looking for that SharePoint document that was posted to our site and deleted 2 months ago. It's those kind of things that we're looking to recover. And something like this, an appliance that's providing connections to Microsoft Azure, is a great way to build this connection. Now, I just talked to the Store Simple guys, and I'm supposed to make a not public but recommended announcement. They're going to do a session on Friday. If you're still here, please come and see it. Today, Veeam is the only partner certified to do this. There is no one else. Because we started with them 2 years ago. Remember the initial concept that I told you about? We don't program or develop something around them, we do it with them. We've been doing it with them now for 2 years, and as they release new functionality for their 9000 series boxes, they'll actually certify that Store Simple box as a primary target. So we can actually take one of those copies out. Instead of doing what I just told you about, where we make an initial backup and we put it on disk locally, well, the Store Simple box is local, right? We just have to specify its requirements and say, don't start streaming until after 21 days. And then when you do start streaming, I want you to make the stream a copy to the blob store that goes on Azure. And we can eliminate some of the costs. They also told me that their promotions, which are in place today, if your business purchases a given amount of Azure, they will simply give you the Store Simple box. So if you're in a business that's mid-level or enterprise, and you're going to purchase $40,000 worth of Azure credits to use in the course of the next year, they will happily hand you the Store Simple box that goes with it. Any questions about Store Simple? I have a question for you about Store Simple. If I use Store Simple, do I still need a Veeam virtual machine in Microsoft Azure? Someone's nodding yes, someone's nodding no. Which one is it? Another no. We're 2 for 2. 3 for 2. The no's are 3. Nodding more is not going to help. Sorry. You don't need one. Your Store Simple box can do direct connections to Microsoft Azure without the need for the Veeam virtual machine on the Azure side. Why would I need a Veeam virtual machine in Microsoft Azure? What if there wasn't a smart piece of hardware acting in between Veeam Private Cloud and Azure Public? That's exactly why I use a Veeam virtual machine. We call it Veeam Cloud Connect for the enterprise, and the role that it plays is similar to what we find from a role in Store Simple. Now, the big difference here is there is no physical device. There is no hardware. There's no fast disk. There's no RAM. There's no network connection. There's none of that stuff. All there is a piece of software running on the Azure end and a piece of software running in your private cloud environment, and you're going to build a secure connection between them. Now, the beauty here is that Veeam's already taken that into account. So there's no configuration of VPNs. We simply use the existing Azure Secure Connection, and we provide authentication from on-premises to Microsoft Azure. And now you have the 2 endpoints, and you can transfer data between them. And we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to make the initial backups on-premises, then we're going to copy those, and the copies are actually going to move up to Microsoft Azure. I know that sounds way too easy, doesn't it? The first time I started writing this down on paper, I thought, wait, this should be really more complicated. This should take longer, this should be harder, this should demand a consultant that comes out to you to do this. But it doesn't. It just doesn't. And the reason it doesn't, frankly, is because the tools that you're going to use have all been developed based on a set of standards, and the tools that Microsoft has built are all developed on the same standards, and everything works. There's got to be some challenge, right? There is. There's a significant one. It's called the 1 terabyte file size limitation. It comes with Microsoft Azure, and it affects everyone who uses it. Today, Microsoft Azure on direct attached storage will only allow files of a 1 terabyte size or smaller. Now I know you're thinking, are you serious? A 1 terabyte file size limitation is a problem for you? It is, because oftentimes our customers are actually building backup jobs that include multiple virtual machines. And when that backup job is completed, we create something called a VBK file. So you can imagine how easy it is to get to a file size that is larger than 1 terabyte. How do I get around that? What can I do? Well, the obvious thing to do would be to beg Mark Rusinovich and the Azure team to increase the file size limitations. And I hear that that's coming, but I don't know when. That would be really nice. If that happens, then a lot of the rest of this slide becomes kind of null and void. You could work with another provider out there. There's this group called Stonefly, and they actually make a cloud-based NAS service so that you can actually aggregate multiple different chunks of data in Microsoft Azure into a single NAS and then point your Veeam connection, your Veeam Cloud Connect for the enterprise in Azure at the NAS that you created. And that's actually really great. Now I'm told, I have not seen this operational, but I'm told that they can do that up to petabytes in size. So that ought to cover about any file size that we would look at today. Now, I could also take multiple 1 terabyte segments in Azure, combine them together, build a storage space, and then connect to that. We have had customers make recommendations to do that kind of aggregate operation. And it does work, but in my mind it's a little bit clunky. I don't like the idea of that, especially when all of us intuitively understand that what we really want is a larger file size. Ideally, we'd love to see something in the 32 terabyte range. That'd be just about right. So keep your fingers crossed. Next time somebody at the Azure team talks to you, say, hey, you going to increase the file size limitation for Microsoft Azure beyond 1 terabyte? They're going to smile, because everybody asks them that. And second, you're going to look really smart, because you'll know about what their #1 challenge is. What about physical workloads? Everybody asks me this question. Why doesn't Veeam back up physical servers? And the answer actually is that we do. We have not done so for many, many years. For the first, I guess 7 years of our company's life, we did not do physical. We only did virtual. And the reason that we didn't do physical is because that's a different operation than backing up virtual machines. Backing up and recovering virtual machines is based on a set of APIs and processes, depending on whether you use VMware or Microsoft, a volume shadow copy service, a standard set of APIs from VMware. Those processes are different than backing up physical. In physical, remember, there is a tie to the underlying hardware. In virtual, there's not. In order to maintain the tie to the underlying hardware, we have to put something on the machine in order to maintain and manage that tie. That something is called a what? An agent. Once you put an agent on a machine, you get everything that goes with it. It's kind of like the genie in Aladdin. You get all power in an itty-bitty living space. When you install an agent on a physical machine, you get incredible cosmic power, and you also get somebody who's going to have to manage those agents all the time. That's going to be their job. So it costs a lot in terms of time and in terms of dollars. We do have a free set of agents that you can use called Veeam Endpoint Protection. We also will introduce in the very near future a set of agents that you can actually run on your Windows servers and allow them to do physical backup. We'll start on premises in the private cloud environment, make the transition, use Veeam Cloud Connect, and pass that data up to Microsoft. Now, Microsoft has a tool that does this. Does anybody know what it's called? Close. DPM is a good guess. It's called Azure Backup. Azure Backup does just this. You install an agent on the machine. Azure Backup takes the backup of the physical machine and it moves it directly to Azure. There is no middle ground. People ask me all the time, does Veeam compete with Azure Backup? And I say no, because our recommendation is that you always back up your machines on premises first. We will not recommend a direct to Azure system. It's not right. It goes against all of the core concepts that we've talked about today. You can't skip concepts and expect to still have high availability. Is it effective at getting data from on-premises to Azure? Absolutely. Would I trust it? Absolutely. Would I rely on it for availability? I wouldn't. It skips one of the important steps, local retention. It's incredibly important. Once I have my data and I've copied it to Microsoft Azure, logic says rather than copying data back and forth, private cloud, public cloud, private cloud, when I want to do restorations, why not recover it to the place where it happens to reside? Early on I told you one of the big things that everybody loves about Veeam is the fact that we have this thing called instant file level or instant virtual machine recovery. And the core concept behind the instant recovery is that we're doing the recovery on the storage where the data resides. I don't have the wait time, the disk I/O write time for the move. Logic says, why not do the same thing if you have data that's backed up to Microsoft Azure? And so we do just that. We use a tool called Direct Restore to Microsoft Azure. Anybody who wants to can use it. It's a free tool. It's not something you pay for. It could be used in conjunction with Veeam's other free tools that do on-premises backup. So you could, in effect, build everything that we're talking about here for quote-unquote free. Microsoft is going to charge you to use Microsoft Azure. I'm sorry. I can't get them to not do that. But I can provide you all of the components that we've talked about from a Veeam perspective to allow you to set this up and do it for free. So Direct Restore for Microsoft Azure lets me quickly restore a Windows and a Linux-based VM, my physical servers, or any endpoints, which would be my client machines, and do it direct to Microsoft Azure. Why would I want to do that? Well, it's easy for me to do that to help me get a test environment, or to do migrations, or to test migrations from on-site to cloud. There are a lot of good reasons to use something like Direct Restore to Microsoft Azure. Beyond the traditional, oh, my website that used to run on-premises just failed, I'd like to recover it to Microsoft Azure and have it continue operations. That's an obvious one. But I might use any of the other things there too. Direct Restore to Microsoft Azure. What about that cool concept that we talked about earlier where I want to be able to define what happens if? What happens if I have a failure of an Exchange server on premises? What do I do? Well, we said earlier I should have a copy on premises first. The logical solution would be try that. What if that isn't available, or what if on premises doesn't exist anymore? Maybe last night's clap of thunder happens to hit your building. It hit mine. All of a sudden the TV stopped working. That's a tragedy for me. I can't fall asleep without Sports Center. I'm going to have to stay up a half hour until they get the TV fixed. And it might be longer than a half hour based on the thunder. The idea of orchestration is providing a set of prioritized steps for recovery and then a way to execute those so that you get recovery times at sub 15-minute RPOs and RTOs. We call it Orchestrator. You can use it. Of course, orchestration is available from the System Center tools and now from Veeam as well. What about things that are coming up in the future? We do have a new version of Veeam called Veeam 9.5, which will come out when Windows Server 2016 comes out, which I'm told is a flexible date. It's been flexible now since April. I'm hoping that it happens sometime in the month of October. Halloween sounds like a good date, so we're going to pick that one. Plus, it'll be a little bit scary, so it kind of fits, right? I'm only kidding. Nothing scary about it. Things that we're expecting to see. We've actually worked with Microsoft as they develop Windows Server 2016. We've seen them add things to Windows Server 2016 that will make us very, very happy. I'll give you some fun examples and ideas, and then we'll let you ask some questions of me. We all want lower RTO and RPO times. We add things like nimble storage integration. We want to minimize disruptions, optimize on-premises resource. We talked about Direct Restore to Microsoft Azure just now. We'll actually build that into the software, so it's not a thing that you have to add on separately. We make management better. We enhance support for vCloud Director. We add full support for Microsoft 2016 data center technologies, things like Nano Server directly support it. the ability to do direct backups for Windows Server 2016 in your VMware environment or the 2016 Hyper-V environment with the brand new rewritten VSS, which now includes the ability to do change block tracking natively in Windows Server instead of having Veeam's third-party driver add-on. We've seen some really nice changes come out of the Windows Server team. We're excited about seeing them implement it. Now, I want to give you some summary stuff. First, if you enjoyed the concepts related to working with data availability in a hybrid environment, please go and fill out the survey. Not only could you win fabulous prizes, yesterday a gentleman that I know won a nice flat screen TV. You should do the same. Second, I need to know your feedback. If you liked the session, tell me. If you didn't like it, tell me. More and most importantly, give me comments. Say, I loved when you talked about this, or I'd like to learn more about that. If you want to see any of the things that we've talked about in demonstration mode, I would encourage you to drop down and visit the guys at our booth. We have our systems engineers here. We bring the technical guys to the Ignite conference. They have a set of different demonstration options. They can show you whatever it is that you want to see. If you want to see failover, if you want to see replication, you want to see links to Azure, you want to see any of the explorers, you want to check times on recovery, go and do so. With that, let's transition over, and we've got about 10 minutes left of official time. Let's go for some questions. What do you guys want to know? Go for the mic for me if you would. Thank you. Uh-huh. Yes. Good question. So let me repeat the question for those of you that didn't hear, because that mic apparently doesn't mic like it's supposed to. So his question is, tell me about replication between off-sites that you own and off-sites to something like Microsoft Azure. Is there any difference in operation? And then tell me about the future roadmap from Veeam around replication. There is a significant difference between doing replication to off-site locations that you own and off-site locations in Microsoft Azure. Specifically, Veeam does not do replication to Microsoft Azure. So we don't measure it because we don't support it. Why would we not do that? Microsoft actually has a free tool that already does it. It's called Azure Site Recovery. It will build the replicas and do them for you. Now, if we were to compare the timings between the two, with Veeam, remember we use an off-site replication scheme that includes something called WAN acceleration. Remember I told you you want to have a WAN accelerator, either an appliance-based WAN accelerator or a software-based WAN accelerator, because I can get the data there about 10 times faster. It uses much less bandwidth. And so when we talk about Veeam in an off-site replication environment, if you can configure it to run replication with WAN acceleration, I can really get that data there fast. Now when we compare that to what ASR does, ASR doesn't currently have that built-in WAN acceleration capability. So if we were to set the two up side by side, your replication with Veeam is going to run about 10 times faster than what you see with something like Azure Site Recovery. Now, I'm certain that Microsoft will add some form of WAN acceleration to Azure Site Recovery because they need it. It's possible, and I say possible because I don't know of any actual announcement from Veeam or from any of its development team that says we will support replication in the future, but I can look and tell you that we currently support replication on the managed service provider side. So logic tells me that at some future day it's likely that we would see some form of replication on the direct to Azure Veeam Cloud Connect for the enterprise side. That's really a great question. Thank you. Next one. If you want, that's cool. It still doesn't work, so I'm going to have to listen.
In the description of your session, it said you would also discuss about the Azure Stack.
Oh, very good. So let's talk about, he said in the description it said we would talk about Azure Stack and Azure Pack, and we definitely need to do that. So when you talk about working with Azure, all of this discussion of how do I get data from private cloud to public cloud is something that Microsoft has addressed using a couple of different methods. The method that's currently in place today with Windows Server 2012 is something called Azure Pack. And it's actually a released add-on that you is sold separately and installed. It's kind of like batteries not included. However, currently Veeam does support the use of Azure Pack to move data between on-premises and Azure environments. It's easy to configure, it's easy to scale, it's easy to work with in its entirety. Now we know that when Windows Server 2016 comes out, that's going to change, right? Azure Pack is going to slip into the limelight, and Azure Stack is going to slip in and make its presence felt. The idea behind Azure Stack is that we want to take the functionality of making applications work in Microsoft Azure, and we want to have those same applications be the ones that you use on premises, and we want that to be native to the operating system. We don't want it to have to be configured as almost like a third-party add-on. We want the support to be native. And the way that Jeffrey Snover and his team have done that at Microsoft is by integrating and using something called Azure Stack. And the Azure Stack is actually Azure Pack, but plus some additional features and functionality. Of course, we're going to work with and support Azure Stack. I wish I could give you details on how that we're going to play, but like everything else with Windows Server 2016, we continue to hear, yes, it will be that way. And someday we'll give you details. It's like the release date. We know that there will be an Azure Stack. We know that there will be some level of support for it. I don't know on day one what that will be yet. We're kind of waiting to see what Jeff and his team decide in terms of what Azure Stack will look like as a final release. I think we're close. I wish I could give you more details around that. Actually, when I wrote the abstract for this session, we discussed back and forth. Do we put Azure Stack in there or not? And I said, I can't imagine at the end of September we won't have final details on what this will be. And here we are at the end of September, and we still don't have final details on what this will be. I apologize for putting that in there, not having more for you. I wish I did. I thought I saw other questions or hands over here. Yes? Oh, Bill McKinley, that is a softball question. He said, do you back up Office 365? So I guess we'd be remiss not to talk about this in this session. We're talking about hybrid cloud. Those of you that are using Office 365 have probably come across a situation or scenario that I guess is fairly commonplace. I get the question all the time. Let's say you're running Office 365 and all of your Exchange mailboxes and the Exchange server are running in that environment, and you suffer some form of interruption. It hasn't happened to me. We've only been on Office 365 for a couple of weeks now. Knock on wood, it won't happen to me. But I'm told that there are individuals who have actually gone lengths of time without Exchange operations because of interruptions in the Office 365 environment. Would it be possible to take what's in Office 365, back up my Exchange server and all of its mailboxes and their contents, and keep a copy on premises in lieu of some failure online? Or, and this one's probably more likely, I may have a group of individuals that I need to remain in my on-premises Exchange environment, and I'll put everybody else in Office 365. In lieu of a failure, could I take the stuff that's running in Office 365, back it up locally, and then restore it to my running Exchange server on premises? If you look at what we've already talked about today, you already know the answer, right? If we did all of the development correctly, and we have the connections to Microsoft Azure and they're secure, then the answer is, of course, we could do that. And actually, that's been announced. You'll see that come available as a solution from us in the next several weeks. So yes, you could back up your Office 365 Exchange environment, bring it on premises, and then in the event of a failure, loss, whatever, actually recover the data from your on-premises environment. Run it on your on-premises private cloud Exchange until Office 365 comes back online. Remember we talked about data sovereignty? It's a data sovereignty issue. That's my data, even though it originates in Office 365, still mine. Microsoft, nice enough to release the API set for us to do that. They see the value in doing it too. So yeah, good question, Bill. You should get a t-shirt for that. meet me down at the booth and we'll hook you up. I don't know that we have an Office 365 demo at the booth. If you're down there, ask them. We may actually have one. Do we have one down there? Awesome. See, I knew it. Our systems engineers are good as it gets. No question. We generally never talk about stuff until they can show you how it works. With that, I told you I always start on time and I always finish on time. We'll give you a minute or two back. Hope you have a great time at Ignite today. My pleasure spending the last hour with you. Go and enjoy a fabulous dinner. Thank you.